The bar in Coronado went silent the moment the three Navy SEALs stepped through the door, their shoulders still carrying the weight of a deployment that had ended only 48 hours earlier. They were looking for one woman. A woman whose name had been whispered through classified after-action reports for nearly a decade, a name half the operators in that room had heard but never seen attached to a face. When the tallest of them walked up to the small woman sitting alone at the corner table and asked if she was really the one who had pulled their team chief out of that compound in Helmand, she didn't answer with words. She didn't show them a medal. She didn't pull out a folded commendation or a faded photograph. She simply set down her glass, looked him dead in the eye, and said 6 words that would echo through that bar for the rest of the night. "The proof is on my body." Then she stood up, turned her back to them, and slowly lowered the collar of her jacket. What those 3 SEALs saw inked across her shoulder blade made the tallest one bring his hand up in a salute so sharp it cut the air. The other 2 followed without a word. The bartender stopped pouring. Somewhere in the back, a glass slipped and shattered. And every operator in that room understood, in that single frozen second, that they were standing in the presence of a legend they had been told never existed. Would you have recognized what was on her skin? Her name was Margaret Elena Cruz, but everyone who served beside her eventually came to call her Maggie. And the few who lived long enough to owe her their lives just called her ma'am with a quiet kind of reverence that no rank insignia could ever explain. She had grown up in a single-wide trailer outside of Yuma, Arizona. The daughter of a Marine Corps veteran who had come home from Beirut with a body full of shrapnel and a soul full of silences he never learned how to break. Her mother had left when Maggie was 9, and from that day forward it was just her and her father. 2 stubborn cruises against the bleached desert and the endless wind that scoured the trailer walls every winter. Her father didn't raise her to be soft. He didn't raise her to be hard either. He raised her to be exactly what the moment in front of her required. And he taught her how to read that moment by making her run the 8 miles into town and back every Saturday with a rucksack full of bricks before he would let her eat breakfast. She didn't complain. She didn't cry. By the time she was 12, she could outshoot every boy in her county at the rifle range. And by the time she was 16, she was teaching adults how to clear a malfunctioning M1A. Her father never told her he was proud of her, not directly. But on the morning of her 17th birthday, he handed her a worn copy of the Navy enlistment paperwork and said only one sentence. He said the sea would take more from her than the desert ever could, and if she still wanted to go after she heard that, then he would drive her to the recruiter himself. She read the papers twice. She folded them carefully, and she told him to start the truck. What she didn't know then, sitting in the passenger seat watching the saguaros blur past the windshield, was that the Navy would not be her final destination. It would only be the doorway. Behind that doorway waited a community of men who measured courage in the dark places where no cameras ever followed. And a war that did not care whether the body carrying the rifle had been born a son or a daughter. All it cared about was whether that body could keep moving when everything inside it begged to stop. Maggie Cruz, 17 years old and 118 pounds soaking wet, did not yet know that she was going to spend the next 20 years answering that question over and over again, and that her answer would carve itself into her skin in ways the recruiters sitting behind that desk in Yuma could never have imagined. Boot camp at Great Lakes nearly broke her in the first week, and it was not because of the physical demands. The push-ups, the runs, the flooded compartments, the endless inspections at 3 in the morning, those things her father had been preparing her for since she was old enough to lace her own boots. What nearly broke her was the loneliness. She was one of 4 women in her division, and 3 of those women washed out before the second weekend. By the time she stood at attention for her first real personnel inspection, she was the only female recruit left in a sea of 78 male voices. She learned very quickly that being the only one meant that every mistake she made would be remembered 10 times longer than any mistake the boy next to her made. She did not allow herself many mistakes. Her rack was always squared. Her shoes always shone. Her shirt tucks were geometric. When her company commander tried to break her by standing her in front of the formation and screaming that she did not belong, she stared straight ahead at the painted line on the far wall and let his words pass through her like wine through a screen door. Her father had taught her that the desert ignored the wind, and so she ignored it too. After A school, she was sent to the fleet as a hospital corpsman, and it was there, in the crowded sickbay of an amphibious assault ship somewhere off the coast of Djibouti, that she first met the operators who would change the entire trajectory of her career. They came in dirty and bleeding from a training accident on the flight deck, and the senior chief who was supposed to triage them was passed out drunk in his stateroom. Maggie made the call alone. She stabilized 2 men with collapsed lungs. She stitched a third with hands that did not shake, and she told a fourth, a giant of a man with a beard that hung halfway down his chest, that he was going to lose the foot if he didn't let her cut the boot off right now. He let her cut the boot off. He kept the foot. And 3 weeks later, when she was reading a paperback on the mess deck, that same giant of a man sat down across from her and asked her if she had ever heard of something called SARC. She had not. He explained that the Navy had recently begun training a small cadre of Special Amphibious Reconnaissance Corpsmen and Special Operations Independent Duty Corpsmen, men and women who served as the medical backbone of the special operations community, and that he thought she had the spine for it. He told her the pipeline would chew her up. He told her most of the women who tried for it never made it through the dive phase. And then he told her something that her father had never said out loud, but had always meant. He told her that the work was real, and that real work was the only thing in this life worth bleeding for. Maggie put a small fold in the corner of her paperback page, set the book down on the table, and asked him where she needed to sign. The pipeline did chew her up. It chewed her up and spit her back out, and chewed her up again. And there were mornings during dive school in Panama City when she sat on the edge of her bunk at 0400 and could not feel her own fingers because the cold water and the chronic exhaustion had stripped the sensation from her hands. She finished every evolution. She finished the pool comp where the instructors ripped her regulator from her mouth and tied her hoses into knots and held her under until her vision tunneled. She finished the long surface swims off the Gulf Coast where the salt burned her eyes so badly she navigated by the sound of her swim buddy's kick. She finished the land warfare phase at Camp Lejeune, the airborne phase at Benning, the survival phase in the mountains of West Virginia, where she went 9 days on 300 calories and learned to skin a rabbit with a broken piece of glass. By the time she pinned on her insignia, she had been training for almost 2.5 years, and she had lost 22 pounds she did not have to lose. Her first deployment came in the spring of her 23rd year. She was attached to a joint task force operating out of Bagram, providing medical support and tactical augmentation to a SEAL team that was running direct action missions against high-value targets in the eastern provinces. The team chief, a master chief named Rourke who had been in the community for 19 years, did not want her there. He told her so the first night, in the gravel courtyard of the safe house, with no cruelty in his voice, but no warmth either. He said that he had nothing against her personally, but that he had buried too many friends to start trusting somebody he had not bled with yet. She told him that she understood, and that she did not need him to trust her. She only needed him to let her do her job when the bullets started flying, and after that, he could decide for himself. He looked at her for a long moment in the dim light of the courtyard, and then he nodded once and walked away. 3 weeks later, on a moonless night in a valley whose name has still never been declassified, an assault element of 7 men hit a compound that turned out to hold 3 times the number of fighters intelligence had predicted. The team chief took a round through the upper thigh that severed his femoral artery, and the medic who was supposed to be on his side of the breach was already down with a chest wound. Maggie went through a window that another operator had blown 30 seconds earlier. She crossed an open courtyard under fire that kicked up dust around her boots like rain on a pond. She found Master Chief Rourke bleeding out behind a low mud wall, with a junior operator pressing useless hands against the wrong artery. She put her knee into the femoral pressure point so hard she cracked one of his ribs. She kept her knee there for 41 minutes while the team fought their way out of the courtyard. He lived. The men who watched her do it would tell that story in quiet rooms for the rest of their lives. The years that followed bled into one another the way they always do for the people who live inside the long war. There were rotations into Iraq and rotations back to Afghanistan. There were quiet months in the Philippines and louder months in places that the Department of Defense has still not formally acknowledged, and there were funerals. More funerals than any 28-year-old should ever have to attend. Maggie wore her dress whites to 17 of them before she stopped counting. She stood in the rain at Arlington for a young petty officer from Tulsa who had been her swim buddy in dive school. She stood in the harsh sun of a small Texas cemetery for the giant, bearded man who had once told her about SARC over a paperback in a mess deck. He had been killed by a roadside bomb outside of Mosul, and his widow had asked Maggie to speak. Maggie did not know what to say, so she told the truth. She said that he had seen something in her that she had not yet learned to see in herself, and that every life she had saved since the day he sat down across from her was a life that he had quietly saved as well. She said that this was the secret of the special operations community, the thing the documentaries and the autobiographies almost never managed to capture. The secret was not the equipment, and it was not the training, and it was not even the courage. The secret was the unbroken chain of one quiet person seeing potential in another quiet person and refusing to let that potential die in the desert wind. After the funeral, she got into her rental car in that small Texas cemetery and she drove for 11 hours without stopping until she reached a tattoo shop in San Antonio that an old friend had recommended. She had been thinking about it for 2 years. She had a folded piece of paper in her wallet with a design on it, a design that she had drawn herself in the margin of a casualty report on a flight back from Kandahar. The design was simple. It was a trident, the same trident that the SEALs wore on their chests, but the trident was being carried by the small, dark figure of a woman in a corpsman's medical pose, kneeling, hands pressed down into the wound of a fallen man. Around the edges of the design, she had written the names of the 17 men whose funerals she had attended, in a script so small and so careful that you had to lean close to read them. She told the artist that she did not want it on her chest. She told him that operators wore their tridents on their chests because they had earned them, and she had not earned a trident. She had only earned the right to carry the men who wore them. She told him to put the design on her shoulder blade, where she could feel the weight of it, but never see it without a mirror. The session took 11 hours. She did not flinch once. The tattoo became, in the small and hidden world of the special operations community, a quiet legend that almost nobody outside of that world ever heard about. The men whose names were inscribed in that script along the edges of the design were men whose families had been told only that their loved ones had died in a training accident, or in a vehicle rollover, or in a place that could not be named on the death certificate. Their real stories existed in a few classified after-action reports and in the memories of the operators who had served beside them, and now those stories also existed on Maggie's shoulder, carried by a woman who refused every promotion that would have taken her out of the field. She made chief, then senior chief, and she kept deploying. She turned down a commission that would have taken her to a desk in Tampa. She turned down a teaching position at the schoolhouse in Coronado. Every time her detailer called her, she said the same thing. She said that the work was real, and that real work was the only thing in this life worth bleeding for. In the spring of her 38th year, on what was supposed to be her final deployment before mandatory retirement from the operational community, her team was inserted into a compound in Helmand Province that intelligence had identified as the holding location for 2 American contractors who had been kidnapped 6 days earlier. The breach went sideways within the first 30 seconds. The compound was wired. The first explosion killed 2 members of the assault element instantly, and the second explosion brought down half of the southern wall onto the team chief. He was a young lieutenant on his first command rotation, a man Maggie had been quietly mentoring for almost a year. She found him pinned beneath a section of mud brick with a punctured lung and a fractured pelvis. She could not move the wall by herself. She put her own body between him and the doorway through which the remaining fighters were now advancing. And she fought a holding action with his rifle and her own sidearm for almost 6 minutes while she simultaneously kept pressure on his chest wound with her left knee. When the quick reaction force finally breached the eastern wall, 2 operators found her still kneeling there, her uniform soaked through with blood that was not entirely her own, and the lieutenant still breathing. They had to physically pry her hand off of his chest. She had taken 3 rounds during the fight, 1 through her vest, 1 through her left calf, and 1 through the meaty part of her right shoulder that had passed cleanly through the very tattoo she had carried for 10 years. The exit wound erased the names of 2 of the 17 men. She had them re-inked 6 months later, in the same shop in San Antonio, and she added the names of the 2 operators who had died in the breach. 19 names now. 19 men. 1 woman who had carried them all. She retired the following year, quietly, in a small ceremony at Coronado that was attended by exactly 14 people, none of whom were from the press. She had refused every interview request. She had refused the documentary offers. She had refused the book deal that a literary agent in New York had been pursuing her with for almost 2 years. She did not believe that her story belonged to her. She believed that it belonged to the 19 men whose names she carried, and she believed that those men had earned the right to be remembered in their own way, by their own families, on their own terms. She bought a small house outside of Alpine, Texas, with a piece of land that ran up against the foothills, and she spent the first 6 months of her retirement doing almost nothing at all. She read books. She fixed a fence. She learned how to make her grandmother's tortillas from a recipe she found in a box of her father's papers after he passed, 2 months before her retirement ceremony. The desert wind came back to her there, the same wind that had once scoured the walls of the trailer outside of Yuma. And she sat on her porch in the evenings and let it pass through her the way she had once let her company commander's words pass through her at boot camp. And then, almost a year after her retirement, on a quiet Tuesday in late October, she drove down to Coronado to attend the change of command ceremony for the lieutenant whose chest she had once kept pressure on with her knee. He was a lieutenant commander now. He had asked her to come, and she had not been able to say no. After the ceremony, he and 2 of his closest friends, all 3 of them now operating at the highest levels of the community, asked her to join them at a small bar near the water for one drink before she drove back to Texas. She agreed. They were running 15 minutes late. She got there first, and it was while she was sitting alone at that corner table, waiting for them, that 3 other SEALs walked through the door. Men she had never met. Men who had heard her name only as a rumor in the after-action reports of a team chief named Rourke who had retired 6 years earlier. They were looking for her. They asked her if the rumors were true. They asked her if she was really the one. And when she gave them the only answer she could give, when she stood up and turned her back and lowered her collar, the salute that the tallest of them snapped in that quiet bar was not a salute for a rank. It was a salute for 19 names inked into the skin of a woman who had refused to put down their weight. What the men in that bar understood, in that single frozen second when the bartender stopped pouring and the glass shattered somewhere in the back, was that the story of Margaret Elena Cruz was not a story about a woman who had survived the Special Operations Pipeline. It was not a story about a woman who had earned a place among warriors who had once told her she did not belong. It was a story about what it actually means to serve. It was a story about the unbroken chain of one quiet person seeing potential in another quiet person, and about the long and silent labor of carrying the names of those who can no longer carry themselves. Maggie Cruz did not wear a trident on her chest because she had not earned one, and she had been the first to say so. But she had carried the men who wore them in the worst hours of their worst nights, and she had carried them again in ink across her shoulder for the rest of her life. The lesson she left behind, the lesson that every young operator who heard the rumor of her tattoo eventually came to understand, was that leadership is not a rank, that courage is not a moment, and that resilience is not the absence of pain. Leadership is the choice to keep your knee on the wound for 41 minutes when your own body is begging you to let go. Courage is going through the window after somebody else has already blown it. And resilience is sitting on a porch in West Texas at the end of a long war, listening to the same desert wind that raised you, and feeling at peace with the weight of 19 names you will carry until the day you join them. If her story moved you, if any of these 19 men felt for a moment like men you might have known, tell us in the comments who you would carry. And share this with someone who needs to hear what real service actually looks like.